welcome to the Skype box for another interview. Reporting from British Columbia, Mr. Kevin Bazzana, scholar and biographer of Glenn Gould. Hi, Kevin.
Hi again to D Major TV.
How are you?
Good, I'm happy to be back.
Thanks a lot for reaching us today for this event. Happy birthday, Mr. Gould, 3rd edition. Like every year on September 25th, we celebrate his genius during his birthday. As our audience know, you are the author of 2 important books of Glenn, Wondrous Range and Glenn Gould, the Performer in the Work, 2 milestones for the fans of the great Canadian pianist. There are many questions that come to us from the fans all over the world, and they are so curious to know how your passion for Glenn Gould was born.
Well, I actually did not know who he was until I was 19. He died when I was 19, and I was living in a big Canadian city at the time, so we got a lot of CBC. And I kept hearing all of these news reports about this famous Canadian pianist who had just died. And as I said, I didn't know who he was. And they talked about him, they played his recordings. And then about a week after he died, CBC television broadcast the film of the Goldberg Variations. And I thought, who is this guy? And from then on, I was captivated by him. He was obviously an extraordinary and unusual musician, and I immediately wanted to know more about him. Very shortly thereafter, I read Jeffrey Payzant's book, and from then on, I've just kept feeding my brain with more and more Glenn Gould.
Of course, there are many fanciful stories about Glenn, which made him almost mythological figure. Isolation, particular repertoire, Bach, Globe and chair. What do you think of Glenn's lifestyle? Was he really a hermit, or do you think he was secretly cultivating a more social life?
Well, one thing I discovered after doing a lot of research, and especially talking to the people that knew him best, the ones who knew him closely and in private, was that a lot of the Gould stories and legends and myths were true to some degree, but exaggerated. And, you know, for instance, I mean, it's very true that he loved solitude and spent a lot of time alone and was nourished by solitude, but it's not the case that he was a hermit. I mean, he was in touch with people all the time, and not just by telephone. One very interesting thing I was told is that, he would get up at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and very often the first thing he would do in a day was go to the CBC building. And not because he necessarily had a broadcast to do, he would just go there to hang around. He'd sit around with people, he'd gossip, he'd get his mail there. So, it's really not true that he couldn't do without people. He did relish his solitude, but he did relish company. And all sorts of things like his refusal to shake hands and all of these stories about him. Very often true to some degree, but greatly exaggerated.
So, another question is Glenn Gould and love. A relationship that is often described as a confrontational. Regarding the biographies, his women generally say that he was a true gentleman of the past, very respectful and polite. Generally speaking of Cornelia Foss as his girlfriend, but in a fond letter there seems to be a declaration of love to a mysterious woman.
Well, I think you're talking about that sort of quasi-letter that has something to do with someone named Dell. Yeah, that I wrote about that in my biography. That's not what people think it is. That's not a love letter. It's a very strange document, and I sort of explain why I think that is. I don't think that has anything to do with real people in his life. But what you said about people saying that he was very courteous and gentlemanly with women. That's definitely true. Although, you know, I get a sense that with his girlfriends, he could also be very controlling and even a little paranoid. And I have a feeling that it was very difficult and frankly exhausting to be his girlfriend, precisely because the controlling aspect of his personality, I think, came out quite strongly in that particular situation. And it must have been a little bit overwhelming, I think, to be in a real close relationship with him. Even some of his friends, his close friends, felt sometimes that you know, he could be an exhausting person.
In addition to gossip, we talk about music today, and which interests us a lot, especially to understand how Glenn got interested very early in electronic instruments, the radio and the microphone. At the time it was a real revolution used in recorders like Glenn, and leaving the concert career must not have been easy for him initially. In your opinion, have there ever been any moments in Glenn's life when he wanted to get back on the scene?
Oh, you mean back on stage? No, that's absolutely not. That was genuine. His hatred of performing in public. That was not only was that genuine, but it went back a long way. I mean, he himself said, you know, when he was very young, 13, 15, you know, it was fun to give concerts, and but as soon as he became a professional. Even in his late teens and his early 20s, even before he had left Canada, he was already talking about concerts being an unimportant part of his musical life, wanting to leave that behind in favor of recording and writing and composing and so forth. So, no, and once he left it behind, there's absolutely no evidence that he ever considered going back. And he turned down a lot of money. If he had wanted to give a comeback recital at any point in his later life, he could have made a fortune, but he just wasn't interested.
So he dedicated his life to video and to recording, of course, and every time we listen to a record or watch a video of Glenn, we always manage to find new aspects of readings, which are always of a disarming freshness. In your opinion, what are the amazing aspects of Glenn's recordings, and what captured the audience so convincingly?
Well, I was immediately captured by how individual he was. I mean, I didn't know who he was when he died, but I listened to a lot of classical music up to that point, and it was immediately obvious how individual he was. And the thing about his recordings is, no matter how much time passes, they still sound individual. And I think if we listen to only 2 or 3 people from the 20th century, 500 years from now, I'm sure Gould will be one of them, because I'm sure he will always sound individual and unlike anyone else. And another thing is that, and this applies to his playing as well as his interpretations, just so strikingly personal. But also his recordings are of a very high quality in terms of technology. When you think about the fact that he was recording, you know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s with the tape and razor blades, and the sheer quality of his recordings is extraordinary. They sound immaculate even by modern standards, and there's something really compelling about them as performances and as recordings. And I have a feeling that will always be true.
Yeah, we are totally agree with your opinion. But as a writer and author, Glenn was also very fond of writing, and he was very active as a journalist. What do you think about his way of writing?
Well, okay. One thing I have to say is that a lot of the people that admire his writing the most speak English as a second language. And I don't know this for sure, but I have a suspicion that the people who have translated Gould's writings have improved his writing slightly. Gould's early writings in particular are really not very good as examples of English language writing, I have to say. He did get better as a writer with age, and so there's a wonderful sort of casual, attractive quality to some of his later writings, particularly when he's writing about himself and his own life and so forth. His early writings are sometimes unbelievably tangled and just impossible to understand. And when you think that some of these writings were delivered as lectures, it just must have been unbelievably, it must have been impossible to understand what he was talking about. And some of the opinions he expressed, Gould's writings are very important for anyone who's interested in Gould. You won't necessarily learn a lot of good, reliable information about things other than Gould from his writings. And here's one other thing I did notice about his writings. When he was writing about something he liked, he was much more informed and much more convincing. When he was writing about things he didn't like, frankly, he usually didn't know what he was talking about. So if you want to learn something about Monteverdi or Mozart or Schumann or Chopin or Stravinsky or Rachmaninoff, you won't find it in Gould's writings. He just didn't know and didn't care. But they're indispensable for learning about him and what he valued and what he cared about. And like I say, in terms of writing style, he did improve greatly as a writer. And it's frankly a shame that we didn't get to read, autobiographical writings that he was considering doing in his later years, but didn't live to do. Those would have been interesting and probably very attractive pieces of writing.
Absolutely. In your deep interview, can be found in the documentary Nice to Meet You, Glenn, made by Major TV, where you also tell us many anecdotes about Glenn and about the research you did. Is there any curiosity you'd like to tell us that you haven't revealed yet? We are waiting also for your famous book number 3 about the posthumous life of Glenn Gould.
I know, yeah, we discussed this last time. I could very much justify writing a third book about Gould, dealing entirely with his posthumous life. There's a great deal there that's happened since my book was published that I would love to include. And in fact, there was a great deal I wrote about his posthumous life in the book that had to be taken out just for reasons of length. Boy, I'm stumped by this question. I'm not sure I can answer it. Maybe this is a sign that I've written too much about Glenn Gould. I can't think of any exciting, thrilling secrets that I haven't revealed. I'll try to think of one before we hang up.
We are waiting for the posthumous life of Glenn, book 3.
Yes, the trilogy.
The trilogy, yes. Thank you so much to Kevin Bazzana, author, biographer of Glenn Gould, for being here today for the 3rd edition of Happy Birthday, Mr. Gould. We have an international audience. Would you like to say something to them that follow this live streaming today with us?
Well, I suppose I have to say happy birthday to Mr. Glenn Gould, who would be what this year, 87? Wow, happy 87th birthday, and hi to everyone at B Major TV, and you're doing wonderful work here. I'm really happy to be part of it. I really like what you're doing, so keep doing it.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. A warm hug, and we look forward to seeing you soon for news about the world of Glenn Gould, for your Bazzana's trilogy, and back to you guys in the studio.
Thank you very much.